Well, it's certainly a privilege for all of you to be here. It is a blessing to us that you're here and that you want to hear more of God's Word and you want to learn from these godly men. I'm privileged to be on the stage with both of them. I revere both of them very highly, and I know that you do too. So what I thought would be helpful, some of the things we know from books, we know their theology, we know their thinking, but we may not know the men, actually. So, just to begin with, Dr. Carson and Dr. Morgan, would you just tell us a little bit about what you're doing now, and then I'm going to ask you to go backwards to how you got to where you are now. So we're going to do some biography. Dr. Carson, what is your actual title and position?
I'm research professor of New Testament at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School on the outskirts of Chicago, and I'm I'm president of the Gospel Coalition. My time is basically divided four ways: Trinity, the Coalition, some writing, some speaking at places like CBU.
So, some writing, like 60. Do you know how many books?
No, it's up there.
Yeah, it's up there. I saw one website that was 57 and another one was 62. So
I haven't counted. I honestly don't know. And these things, it often depends on what you're counting. I mean, books with my name on the cover where I've written them or edited them, it's 60-ish. But then there's another 60 that belong to the series that I edit as well. I edit 3 series.
Right.
And I didn't write them. I went to Chris Morgan and said, I think you ought to write a book in this series. And so he's writing the book, and then my name goes on as the editor. It's a nice system.
Well, he's doing the same thing now to others. So. All right, so Chris Morgan, what is your title?
Dean and Professor of Theology at the School of Christian Ministries here at CBU.
Yeah.
And so,
okay, and how many books have you written?
I don't know, not 60.
Not 60. Somewhere sub 60.
15, 16, somewhere in there.
Yeah, but you're so much younger than I am, You'll go way by me in due course.
Right. Yeah.
Well, it really is, for that reason alone, a wonderful privilege for us to have Chris here at your stage of your career and Dr. Carson at your stage of your career. I'm wondering if there might be some similarities in your backgrounds. Did you both grow up in Christian homes? A little bit about where you grew up?
I certainly did. My father was a Baptist church planter in French Canada. So, in fact, I wrote a little book about him called Memoirs of an Ordinary Pastor. But because he was brought up in English and had to learn French to work in French Canada, I could have titled the book Memoirs of an Ordinary Missionary, because he was certainly a cross-cultural pastor. So that was the framework in which I was brought up. You know how you go back and try to ask yourself, what's the earliest memory that you've got? How far back can you reach? I think my earliest memory, mind you, the chronology gets a little fuzzy if you go back far enough, but was my father bathing me when I was too young really to bath myself properly. If my mother did it, she was efficient. She had many strengths, but bath time was not story time. That came later. But my father was methodical about everything. So he told Bible stories in the bathtub. And he would always review the last one and then go on with the next one. And so there are some stories, that are really very efficient in a bathtub, like Naaman being dipped in the Jordan 7 times. So my Bible background starts in the bathtub. What can I say?
Hence a Baptist.
Yeah, that's right.
That does explain being Baptist. Yeah. That's great.
Well, my earliest memory is, I think, the New York Yankees beating the Los Angeles Dodgers in the World Series with Greg Nettles diving. No. I was raised in a Christian home. My dad's a phenomenal man. My mom's terrific. Just an epitome of what you would want to be as parents. He was the youngest deacon ever at the church that we were at. Been there for years and years, taught Sunday school for years and years. Mom was in the middle of everything. So my brother's a deacon in a church. It was a privilege. So I grew up hearing the Bible, being in Sunday school, church, Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night. I was weird. I guess I was listening to sermons and lectures when I was like 13. on tape. Back then, there were tapes, guys. You heard of tapes, students?
Yeah.
And,
Reel to reel.
it wasn't 8 tracks, but cassettes. You might have seen them in the history books, and would listen to loads of those through the high school years.
So were you, even in your high school years, were you desiring to be a pastor? Did you ever see that on the horizon at that point?
People told me after I saw it, I guess, that they saw it, but I was just working and, being a teenager, going to the youth group. And
That's not an average teenager.
I was witnessing and teaching some things, but nothing, I don't think anything particular that made me think ministry necessarily, just serve the Lord with what's in front of me and figure it out.
So at what point, how did the call for you come to ministry?
I was in college. I started off being a math major. I wanted to be have a PhD in math. Were you math?
Yeah, he's chemistry, right?
Primarily chemistry, but
Yeah.
just a minor in math as well, because I waffled between theoretical physics and organic chemistry. And so the theoretical physics had to have the math,
There you go. Good. So
This is fantastic. It's actually terribly discouraging to most of us, but it's great.
I mean,
So-
I paid my way through seminary in part by teaching first-year calculus at a junior college nearby.
That's great. That's great.
So
A lot is coming together for us.
yeah. So math
Brilliant.
was a passion of mine, but I actually felt like I got bored with the math, and so I thought I think people should love math, and it's wonderful. And if you're a major in math, keep majoring and go get a PhD. Do what you're supposed to do. God can use all of us and all the different gifts, but my particular interests were shifting, and I was shifting toward people, trying to understand them. And so I went to political philosophy. I was at a state university, trying to figure out the world around me in that regard. Then along the way, my freshman year at the college, I was asked to teach a Bible study at the Baptist Student Union, and asked to teach in different services. And along the way, the next thing you know, I was invited to preach at a church on a weekend, and the next thing you know, I was preaching 33 weekends, I think it was, out of 52, whatever those 52 weeks in a row were. And then the next thing you know, I was just sort of going, well, duh, this is what I'm supposed to do. And
This is
so
still in college?
This is in college. I was freshman, sophomore year. I was a baseball player, a pitcher who got hurt and was unable to travel on the away games, so I had a lot of extra time that I didn't expect to have, and I was able to use it in those ways.
Excellent. Dr. Carson, how about your transition to call to ministry?
Nobody asked me to pitch. No, my first degree was chemistry with minor in math, and my intention was to go to get into Cornell to do organic synthesis. I mean, that was the trajectory I was heading for. And the call to ministry was complex. It wasn't one stage. The first step was when the minister of our Baptist church in Montreal, when I was still an undergraduate, asked me if I would help as an intern one summer for 4 months. And I explained to him that I thought he probably confused me with somebody else because we had 80, perhaps, college and career students in that church. And some of them were planning on heading for the ministry, and they're the ones that he really should be inviting, and not me. And he said, no, he hadn't made a mistake. He wanted me, and so we had a 2-hour argument. And and I won. I didn't help him. I did some more chemistry. But that was the first impetus to start thinking about things like this. Of course, that's entirely in line with 2 Timothy 2:2. The things that you have learned, you pass on to other men who will be able to teach yet others, and so on. He was exercising his 1 Timothy 2:2 function.
And your functioning as Jacob is
Maybe
wrestling.
not quite as far as Demas, but no. I mean, I was involved. Ramez Atala, an Egyptian friend, was president of InterVarsity at McGill. I was vice president, and I mean, I was involved in all the sort of Christian university student things and so on. First time I heard John Stott, first time I heard Dick Lucas is when I was an undergraduate at McGill in the 60s, and they were speaking at McGill missions and so on.
Great.
So, but then eventually, while I was working in a research lab in Ottawa in air pollution, another friend of mine was planting a church up the valley, and I would help him on the weekends. And I discovered that in the lab, my fellow workers could be broken down into two groups. One group was approaching retirement age and they could hardly wait to get out there and go fishing. And the other group were young buffs who all thought of themselves as getting Nobel Prizes in chemistry. And I wasn't in either camp. I mean, I was enjoying the project, had a good budget, having a whale of a lot of fun. It was a nice job. But my imagination was being sparked more and more by this fledgling church up the valley. So that was another step. Then I couldn't get out of my head a chorus I learned in Sunday school. By and by when I look on his face, beautiful face, thorn-shadowed face, by and by when I look on his face, I'll wish I had given him more. And I could picture myself saying, here God, here's my chemistry, pretty cool, isn't it? And again, I still insist theologically, some people are called to be chemists and are supposed to act faithfully and wisely and offer their work to God and so on, but this is where I was. And then I heard a missionary to Haiti. He was the father of Becky, who was going out with Ramez. So we were all sort of connected. And this missionary to Haiti preached on Ezekiel 22. I sought for a man to stand in the gap before me for my people, but I found none. And that became another step in the call. So eventually then I maintained the chemistry, but I picked up a couple of years of classical Greek and things like that in preparation for seminary, and then went to a seminary in Toronto.
Amen. We're so glad. We're so glad. So each of you...
But you don't know what I might have done in chemistry.
I don't care. I know what you've done in biblical theology, so I don't care what you might have done in chemistry. So thankful. But, all right, so in this call and in this move, both of you gravitated towards the church and towards pastoral ministry, church planting or in preaching and pastoring. At what point did that move get you back to where you are now, which is educational institutions, graduate level, undergraduate level? What's the transition that brought you to realize that this was a significant way to spend your life?
As soon as I felt the sense that ministry would some sort of pastoral ministry is what I was supposed to do, I became a youth pastor sophomore year, February. By the way, I was engaged to be married since that direction, and became a youth pastor all the same month, my sophomore year in February. My eyes were twitching everywhere. I was in the doctor's office trying to figure out what was going on, and he said, that's just called stress.
Yeah.
And so I loved it. It was fun to be a part of a church, teach every week, Sunday morning, Sunday school, and Wednesday night, and try to reach students around. And along the way, I decided I needed to go to seminary, and was privileged to go to Mid-America Baptist Seminary. The Southern Baptist seminaries were beginnings of war at that point, and actually a friend of mine now who wouldn't be theologically where I am or where most of us in this room was, but would be called moderate, recommended Mid-America because he said they'll actually like each other there the whole time you're there. And it was a really great place, and I enjoyed it. And then while I was there, I pastored in a little town of 81. I'm not exaggerating.
The town had 81.
Sounds like one of your stories.
Not the church,
but this one's true. All right, and but a town of 81 people, and I drove literally 125 miles to Memphis to seminary for 5.5 years. I loved it. It was perfect for me. The church was like 18 people. Counting my wife and I at first, we got to 98 people. The town went from 81 to 68. People were getting saved all over the area. It's just a little bit.
So more members in the church than there were citizens in the town.
Yeah, and I was so dumb. I was so impatient, thinking, well, why aren't we at 300 by now? You know, I mean, why aren't they driving in? Why aren't they driving in 50 miles? Why is 15 all we're getting? You know, and all that kind of stuff. It didn't have enough sense, but the Lord used that. I felt like every day I drove home from seminary, I was asking the question, now what does Bill need? I was driving, I'm seeing him drive on his tractor. It was a wonderful husband, a wonderful dad, a wonderful man, a wonderful leader in the church. But all that I learned today, what does he need to know of what I learned? I need to know all of it. What does he need to know? So it was a distilling process to learn how to teach and preach and shepherd in that world. And there were several 70-year-old deacons who were exceptionally patient with a 21-year-old when I started, and being a part of that. Then along the way in seminary, I loved every minute of it. I loved every minute of pastoring, basically. It was a happy church. I didn't realize how happy at the time. I mean, amazing, really. And just loved my studies, wanted to keep studying more. I was probably the only guy that ever got laughed at by the PhD director when I asked, can you do 2 different doctorates at the same time? Because I wanted to do 2 different fields. I didn't know better. I didn't know anything. My parents weren't college folks. This was all new to me. And so I just wanted to learn all I could learn and be pushed as far as I could be pushed in the time that I had. And then along the way, I was teaching a class at the seminary, taught a class at Union University, taught seminary extension classes to pastors who were 50 and 60 years old, and I was 23, 4, and but they were patient with me, and I thought was very, very good experience. And so I don't know, along the way, teaching and pastoring seemed like the same thing in some sense. I mean, I was discipling through the teaching, and I was discipling through the pastoring. The church is always the centerpiece of God's action in the Bible, but God uses all the body to reach all the different domains of society, and so I was just trying to use the various domains that I could be of use in. And then along the way, Dan Wilson mistakenly called me and invited me to come and do an interview out here, and we hit it off.
Guilty party's in the back.
Yeah, Dan's in the back. We hit it off, and I stayed. But before I ever started teaching a class here, Paul Wilkerson, who was the director of missions back then, had me set up to preach. I was here like 3 Sundays before I taught. I preached all 3. I didn't miss a sermon. I mean, I was preaching every single week I didn't have my U-Haul unloaded, and I was already able to be a part of church life and serve the Lord in that way. And then along the way became an interim pastor at Barstow, later became part-time senior pastor. And I basically, up until right now, I've been a teaching pastor and a professor the whole time. So I don't know. I just think I'm called to serve the church. Called to serve the church through teaching and preaching, but I'm called to serve the church through shepherding future leaders.
It's so great because you see how just thoroughly integrated academic theology is with expression through the local church. And that exercise that you went through to think through what you're learning at the PhD level and how it affects Bill on the tractor. I can remember when I was in my PhD, I would go from a seminar, and I drove about an hour to my church as well. And I would take whatever the main point was of our seminar that we had discussed so thoroughly and debated and went around, and it was my task to be an Awana leader. So I would make my message for my Awana kids to be that point and just try to figure out how what we were talking about in PhD seminar could possibly affect, grade school students, and just work through that. What an exercise! That's great. I'm glad to know that I'm not alone doing that sort of thing. That's perfect, integrating it in the church.
The result was he had a whole lot of Awana kids who could talk about the eternal generation of the sun.
But they didn't realize I wasn't talking about the sun in the sky. Dr. Carson, how did it come about for you from a call to ministry to actually academic work?
Well, I was involved in a couple of church plants, one in English, one in French, and then became pastor of a church in Vancouver through complicated means. And the church was beginning to grow. Nearby was a Baptist theological college where I had occasionally given a lecture to substitute for somebody who was ill. And then somebody died on their faculty, and they asked me to come and join them. And I thought, this is ridiculous. I have an MDiv. You should have a PhD before you do that sort of thing. And we were at a turning point in the church. We just bought property next door. We were going to tear down and build So I either had to see that through and then stay for 5 years sort of thing, or leave then. And I had taken some courses from F.F. Bruce at Regent College. So I thought, well, maybe this is the time to do something after all, even though I haven't been here all that long. So I applied to Manchester, to F.F. Bruce, and was accepted, and announced to the church that I was leaving that September to go to England. And somebody said to me, a fellow pastor who was from England, why don't you apply to Cambridge? I said, well, probably wouldn't get in there. And he said, well, the worst they can do is say no. And so I applied to Cambridge about 6 weeks late past their deadline, and I got into Cambridge. So I went to Cambridge. And the first weekend I was in Cambridge, I bumped into F.F. Bruce on the sidewalk. And he said, what are you doing here? I said, well, you know, I'm very grateful that Manchester accepted me, but I thought at the end of the day, maybe I'd come here instead. And he said, well, I can't criticize that. I came here too. So which marked him out as the gracious one between us. And at the end of that time, it came down to a choice between serving as theological secretary for IFES. That's the International Federation of Evangelical Students. It's the international organization that joins all the universities around the world, and would have kept me in Europe. And my roots are strongly in Europe in any case, so I'm happy in Europe. Or to go back to that small Baptist college back in Vancouver with the aim of starting a seminary wing. And it's a long, difficult story as to how decisions were made, but eventually the Lord led me back to Vancouver. And I was there for 3 years, and during that time my wife and I started another church on the side as
It's
well.
at least number 3.
Yeah.
Right.
And I just didn't like the direction in which the seminary was going at the time for a variety of reasons. So I announced at Christmas that I was resigning and was planning on going back to pastoral ministry that next summer. But in God's mysterious providence, in those days, ETS, the Evangelical Theological Society, and SBL, Society of Biblical Literature, had their annual meetings between Christmas and New Year's. Now that seems to you, I'm sure, like an abomination that makes desolate, but that's the way it was done in those days. And that year, the conferences were held in San Francisco, and I was down to deliver a paper on some technical something or other. And unbeknown to me, Kenneth Conser, who was then the dean of Trinity, was sitting in the audience. And he asked me afterwards if I would consider going to join Trinity's faculty. Up to that point, I had not given 30 seconds of reflection on coming south of the 49th parallel. That's the United States.
Yeah.
I'm Canadian and European. I'm not going to the United States. It's not that I had anything against it. I just never even thought of it. I mean, all my orientation was Canadian and European, English, French, and then ultimately German and other things. But I just never thought south of the 49th parallel. That's down there.
Yeah.
When I flew to Chicago, I was going down to Chicago. But what I said to Conser was, if you had asked me 2 months ago, or you had asked me 2 months from now, I wouldn't have even considered it, because my direction would be set. But at the moment, I am in transition. I'll at least talk to you. He said, tomorrow morning for breakfast at 7 o'clock. And so that led to interviews and so on. And so that summer, my wife and I drove down in a Ryder truck to Trinity. So in one fashion or another, I've been there for 37 years now. This is my 38th year.
Excellent. Could you give us a little bit, because I think probably for some of us, the name Conser is we're aware of, maybe not as familiar with as we need to be, but he was a significant figure in American evangelicalism and in your own life. Would you mind just filling us in on everything that we need to know briefly about Dr. Conser?
Kenneth S. Conser was, before he came to Trinity, he was a professor of systematic theology at Wheaton College. He had studied under Karl Barth in Switzerland and done his doctoral dissertation. But he was registered at Harvard just the same, and did his dissertation on John Calvin. And in one memorable debate with another Calvin scholar, when Carson was still a young man, they were disputing some point or other about whether Calvin really believed this or that. And the other chap said, "I don't suppose anybody's ever read everything that Calvin's written." And Kenneth Carson said quietly, "I have." I mean, he had scoured the libraries of Europe, and whether things were written in Latin or French didn't make any difference. If Calvin had written it, he had read it. And so he had potential for being one of the greats on Calvin. But in fact, when he left Wheaton to come to be the founding dean of the graduate school of the Trinity Seminary in 61, 63, he really turned away from high-level academics. He continued to do some writing and so on, but he really devoted his life to building the seminary and made it one of the premier seminaries in the country in terms of its influence. Its influence not least in the SBC in one form or another too. So then eventually Kenneth Carson became editor of Christianity Today and had a lot of influence that way. And in those days he was friends of almost all the leaders that were really significant in North American evangelicalism. Carl Henry, a phone call away from Billy Graham. I mean, there was a coterie of these guys that knew each other, and he was one of that coterie. And so he was a man who, while he had a specialism in church history, especially Calvin, yet his knowledge of Bible and theology was astonishingly broad, so that he could engage all of his faculty members on all kinds of things. He never blew up. He built a faculty that was sometimes a bit squabbly. They were all conservative, confessional, but some of them liked a good fight. And I won't mention any names, but if those of you with long memories will know who they are. And I never, ever saw him lose his cool. I mean, I remember when one particular notable, whose name you would recognize, called Carson a liar to his face in the faculty meeting. And Carson would sit in the faculty meeting like this and always answer with courtesy and respect. But if he was really, really ticked, his foot went like that. There were only 3 or 4 of us who knew it, but we watched that foot going, well, this is getting interesting. But he demonstrated the fruit of the Spirit in self-control and won enormous respect. So he was influential on all kinds of theological fronts, especially the inerrancy of Scripture. So I was the last full-time faculty member he appointed while he was still dean. And in some ways, our kids, who are now 30 and 33, became the Carson surrogate grandchildren. His own daughter lived on the West Coast, and his son lived on the East Coast, and he had us instead, which was jolly good for my kids. Yeah. And they can still remember running and playing with Grandpa Carson.
So you were also close to Carl Henry?
Yes, initially not as close, but John Woodbridge and I edited a Festschrift in his honor in 1980, so it goes back at least that far, and on Christ and culture. And Henry had been he was the founding editor of Christianity Today, and he was the one with Billy Graham money to put together the Berlin Congress on World Evangelization in 1961. I didn't get to that, I was still in high school. But on the other hand, that morphed eventually into Lausanne. So there are not many worldwide evangelical institutions that either Henry or Carson did not touch in those days. And eventually, and he was one of the early faculty members at Fuller, for example. He and Gleason Archer and 2 others. So that was in 1949. That was when Fuller was promising to be the bright hope of evangelicalism. or so we hoped and prayed. And eventually he traveled for quite a few years under the aegis of World Vision to teach and preach all around the world in mission centers to missionaries. For years and years and years, there was scarcely a place he didn't go. And then later, when he was in his in a retirement center in a town about 2 hours away from where my wife and I lived, we used to drive over to see him about every 6 weeks for half a day. And he would always ask where I had been recently. And no matter where I had been, he had been there before me and wanted to know how the church was doing there and could mention people's names and looking to the future and what do you think about this and where's that going and so on. So interested in the world right to the time of his death. And so he, in his last 15 years or so, when he wasn't regularly traveling and teaching anymore, his health wasn't up to it. Nevertheless, until the last 2 years, he would come down to Trinity and teach modular courses. He'd fly in from somewhere for a long time. For a long time, he lived in Washington, D.C., and was a member of the Baptist church where Mark Dever is currently pastor, Capitol Hill Baptist. And Carl Henry and I and one or two others were instrumental in pointing Mark in the direction of Capitol Hill Baptist. That was partly Carl's doing, and then I spoke at Mark's inauguration, or installation. So there are all these sort of family connections, you know. And then, so he would come down and teach modular courses for anywhere between a week and a month at Trinity for 10 or 15 years. And I've told a couple of the guys this, but I'll have to tell you this too. He had some problems with his legs, and we always sent a student down to the airport to pick him up and bring him up to a nice suite on the campus. And one day this student was driving him on the main drag of the campus, and off to the left is the Rolfing Library with a wing on it with the words, the Carl F.H. Henry Resource Center. And the student was in awe of the great man. Dr. Henry, what does it feel like to have a building named after you? Henry looked at it and he said, feels like I should be dead. So that was Carl Henry, and people don't realize how many pies he had fingers in.
I wanted to follow up on that actually, because I know with both of you, we know we're getting sound biblical theology. We know it's going to be integrated towards the church and towards the gospel and towards the kingdom. But I think sometimes we lose track of the fact that this good, solid biblical theology is supposed to work itself out in very practical ways. And so, you know, what you've mentioned already, the Billy Graham Evangelistic Association, World Vision, the Lausanne Congress, you know, these things are not necessarily separated from good, solid biblical theology. And just would like to have you comment on that maybe about if we're thinking as pastors that theology is one thing and evangelism is another, somehow we're not connecting some bridges that should be connected there.
Let me tell you another story about Carl. Carl did both a PhD and a THD, one at Northern Baptist Seminary, the other at Boston University, and one in theology, one in philosophy. But in 1947, I think the date was, he wrote a book, The Uneasy Social Conscience of the Fundamentalist. Now, we pride ourselves today in trying to have Christians that are square with the gospel, but also care for the poor and the broken. Let me tell you, Carl Henry was there in the late 40s. That book was a bombshell. I mean, it just exploded, you see. But as part of his self-discipline in writing that, besides his theology, and he'd written a very learned tome on personal Christian ethics and things of that order. Yeah, it is good. But in preparation for that book, he went and lived like a street tramp with no money, living on the streets for 4 or 5 weeks in Chicago, befriending these guys and eating out of soup kitchens. And mind you, his cover was a bit blown one night at one of the soup kitchens that he went to when a student at the front recognized him. He was there in old clothes and I wonder if Dr. Henry would like to close in prayer, you know. This tramp stood up. But that, we forget that there were a generation of these giants who were thinking integratively long before our generation was. And that's part of the heritage of the man. He could not talk about Christ. He was one of the best personal evangelists I've met. We'd go out for a meal, and he would be faster than I would be to share his faith or give some literature or something to the waiter or waitress that was serving our table and so on. He was quite a remarkable man. For all of his vast learning, he was just an ordinary Christian.
Excellent. I want to hear your thoughts on this. Come on, speak up.
Depends where you want to go with this. I think if we believe in the unity of the church, and we believe that that actually should result in something, then we're going to form relationships where churches can work together on various issues, because one church can't pull it all off. And so that can take the form of denominations, and as long as that doesn't become the centerpiece of identity, that can be very helpful. It can take the form of networks, missions networks, other networks, gospel coalition.
Right.
It can become tools by which we work together for common good and promote critically important things of that particular era. So I think it's very important.
So what do you two see as a distinction, if there's any, if you believe there's any, if not, between the graduate level seminary education and the undergraduate education? Is one sufficient? Are both needed? Because all questions of education, I think, are being rethought now, and education is being restructured in many ways. So what do we need? What must we hold on to for the sake of the gospel and the kingdom and the church? And how do these undergraduate-graduate relationships work, in your opinion?
I don't know if you'll totally agree with me. We'll see. But needed is a strong word. So I would say what's needed is the church. Christ building his people, the church leaders raising up leaders, and some of those leaders are called to be pastors. And all the leaders need to grow. They all need to be discipled. They all need to move forward. Those who are going to be called to teach and have the shepherding responsibility better know what they're doing. It's a very important role. It can mess everything up, and it becomes sort of a centerpiece of the structure of discipling. So that person needs to grow in their knowledge of the Bible. They need to know the biblical story. They need to know sound doctrine. They need to be able to feed the sheep. They need to be able to raise up others who can do the same thing. They need to be able to have people in the right places in the church that can organize them to do the right thing. Those people, those churches, raise up all kinds of leaders. Some of them are called to be pastors. Places like CBU, we can be broad enough to be of help to all of them, basically. Mm-hmm. So if they're going to be a nurse, they can come here, grow in their nursing skills, grow in their worldview, grow in their sense of the church and mission, and so forth. We can help them. Those who are called to be engineers the same way. Those who are called to be pastors the same way. If we know that early enough, they can be in one of our programs and be studying Bible heavy duty, seriously, theology, church history, and so forth, philosophy heavy duty, so that they can become very useful, better discipled, better disciplers, better leaders. Then, if it all works out, they should go on to seminary as much as possible. I'm not saying it's sin not to or something, but it seems like the right step for most people would be to get better, to grow more, to be stretched further, to be pushed as hard as they possibly can to be all they're supposed to be in the Lord, and to push to the nth degree and to go to seminary and be trained even farther in biblical studies and so forth, all the way through the skills. So how that's labeled institutionally, I've never thought mattered as much as that process happens. The church stays central. Universities and seminaries serve the church by doing some things that it's basically just churches working together, like the Lausanne Conference, like Gospel Coalition. In a sense, that's what institutions like this are doing. It's just church leaders getting together and making sure we do something well that we couldn't do individually in local churches, to help folks move forward to the next level. Then they can teach others who will be able to teach others also.
Dr. Carson?
I do think that Mark Dever, whose name most of you will know, pastor of Capitol Hill Baptist Church, and he's on the board of Southern Seminary as well. He's been here,
yes,
so
he's been
his
here.
name is known. Good. I think that he's put his finger on something really quite important, namely that in the New Testament, when a person trusted Christ, he or she was baptized and became a member of a church, all as one step. There was no such thing as a Christian who trusted Christ but was not baptized yet, nor someone who was a Christian and baptized but decided not to join a church yet. It was inconceivable. After all, if the gospel changes you so that we love one another, who's the one another? That presupposes already a church context. So there's an organic element of otherness in the body of the church, which brings along with it teaching and discipline and all the other good things that the church is about. And that needs to be recovered in many, many SB circles. And not only in SB circles. So I agree with the emphasis that Chris has laid on the centrality of the church as the primary training ground and so on. And then it has to be said that there are many, many, many forms of theological educational delivery. And they're becoming more complex today with the digital world and mega churches doing their own things and translated stuff from other languages and cultures and so on. But after you've been around for a few decades and you watch these movements come and go, you also discover that there is a central place for formal training. Just because the average local church, even a very good local church, is just usually not equipped to teach its pastors the rigors of good exegesis and to become really informed of church history and so on and so on and so on. It just is not equipped. The odd church is, but it's very odd. And so the auxiliary institutions serve an important role in all of this. In terms of undergraduate versus graduate, again, an awful lot depends on what your constituency is. If you're SBC, then there are thousands of churches. What's the average size of an SBC church? It's just under 75. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's right. And many of them, the majority of them, the overwhelming majority of them are rural. And so, you know, the big names come to us for pastoring a church of 3,000 or 5,000 or something in central Dallas or something. But that's not where the heart of the SBC is. And so you've got thousands of churches where congregations number 70 people, and there may be virtually no one in the church with a bachelor's degree. They're hardworking, honest, good folk, and they can read and all of that. But on the other hand, it's not a church that's in the research triangle around Duke. It's not where it is. And so to have a pastor with a good, solid Bachelor of Theology puts him streets ahead of just about anybody in the congregation, and he's got a context in which he can minister faithfully and so on. On the other hand, like it or not, the trends demographically in this country are toward urbanization. And with urbanization usually comes more publishing, more media, more education, higher expectations, and so on. So in many churches in urban centers, 60, 70, 80, 90% of the adults already have a degree. And in some churches, you'll find 10, 20% of them have advanced degrees. Mm-hmm. And to put a young guy in there with a bachelor's degree in theology and ask him to become pastor of the church is asking a bit much. Unless he's got the name Spurgeon. He'll probably burn out.
Or Morgan or Carson.
No. Definitely not. I mean,
young pastors.
When Spurgeon was 19 years old, he was pastoring. He'd been pastoring from the age of 18 out in Waterbeach, just outside of Cambridge. And the church in London called him when he was 19. And he was thinking at the time, should I stop for theological education first? And he was walking the 4 miles back to his digs in Cambridge, crossing Midsummer Common and so what's it called, Jesus Green. He was crossing Jesus Green, And he said, "Methought I heard a voice behind me saying, 'Seekest thou great things for thyself? Seek them not, seek them not.'" So he became pastor of the church in London, and the rest is history. But on the other hand, if you are so foolish as to think you should go and do likewise, may God have mercy on your soul. I mean, there are just not many people with his gifts and capacity for self-learning, and he taught himself Greek and Hebrew, and was voracious in his reading. All you have to read is his Treasury of David, for example, to see how he devoured commentaries and so on. And let's be quite frank, most of us are not in his camp. And so then there are other denominations, like, for example, the PCA, where they make it a matter of baseline pastoral credentialing to have an MDiv. That's baseline. Now, that wouldn't work with all of the rural churches and so on in the SBC, but in a lot of Presbyterian circles, that seems reasonable enough. So a lot of those judgments, it seems to me, have to be made on denominational levels, ecclesiastical levels, and so on. And besides, you do find some people with a bachelor's degree who enter into pastoral ministry and grow, and in due course become pastors of large churches where they can handle elevated discussion. But it's not the normal. And if you're trying to build institutions to address the diversities of needs and training and so on, then what Chris Morgan said is right. For those who have got a bachelor's degree in theology, the normal course is to want more and to get as much as you can in preparation for local church ministry.
How should our pastors, the ones who are in ministry, the ones that are engaging their congregation, teaching theology, seeing it connect with some, how should they be thinking about identifying possible pastors? Like you, Dr. Carson, wrestled with 2 hours for 2 hours with, should that be the norm? Should we be approaching these young people for ministry and asking them and encouraging them, or should we wait for them to take the initiative? Because I know some are reticent to say, hey, I think you need to be thinking about ministry a little more seriously. Some are hesitant to do that. How, as a pastor, should you identify and approach people that you think could be effective in ministry?
Well, the fact is that the New Testament gives us a diversity of patterns of calls. So that in 1 Timothy 3, for example, if anyone desires the work of the ministry, or desires to be an elder, the term is there, but elders, pastors, bishops in the New Testament all refer to the same office. If anybody desires this, he desires the good things. Now, these are the qualifications. So that's one way. And then another way is 1 Timothy 2:2, where somebody taps you on the shoulder. And there are identifiably 4 or 5 different models of how people actually begin to get called. Undergirding this is a deeper discussion. There are some Christians out of the mold of Martin Lloyd-Jones, for example, who argue don't go into the ministry unless you've had a profound call of God upon your life. Mm-hmm. Just don't do it. And there are others in the mode of Philip Jensen from Australia, who's a spectacularly effective evangelist, who basically says, you've got the call. It's called the Great Commission. Get off your duff. You need to have a good reason not to go. Do you see? And now how you put that theology together with Martin Lloyd-Jones, I'm not quite sure. But I would argue that in the New Testament, there is some sort of ongoing tension between the two. The mandate is there. We should be seeking to present the gospel to every creature. You don't have to have a certain kind of mystical experience before you go. Yet at the same time, not everybody who thinks he's ready to go is. And so there is also an element of being tested in the church, and the church credentialing you because it sees the gifts and graces that God has given you, or refusing to do so for good reason too. And so we live with a dynamic of those tensions. But if you ask which way should be normative, my answer is yes.
Yes.
Use them all.
Go into ministry.
Yeah, and
Use them all.
what should be normative is the pastor is a serious discipler and raising up serious disciplers and is paying attention to the various leaders and the various gifts in the body and those that they see that have teaching gifts, leadership gifts, or at least potential for that. They need to have their eye on and be doing their part to have conversations with them, get to know them, bring them along in ministry, and along the way they'll have a better perception of whether they think this is the case. The person can deal with it internally in their own walk with the Lord. The pastor and the leaders of the church can deal with it from a wisdom standpoint. I mean, after all, James 3's, the church is very critical in who should and shouldn't be teachers. And so along the way, that process will, I think, show up. But I think what happens in a lot of churches, I know we're all busy, is there's so much to do. Sometimes you're just in survival mode is what I call it, and you're not paying attention to the people around you and not raising them up, but you're just getting your job done. You think the job done, but then somewhere down the line, the job is getting the people raised up. So I think that would be, we know for sure that's what we're supposed to do. So do the pastors know the current leaders well enough to be in their lives? Do they know the up and comers? At least are they discipling the people who are discipling them, so that there's a system by which they'll have information about them that they can take to the next level?
Well, so we're actually getting very close to the end of our time, but I wanted to leave it open for the two of you. If there's a message or a burden that you would like to share, both with students and pastors, maybe looking forward, just encouragements, priorities, or just stick-to-itiveness. How you would like to encourage, and a last word that you would like to leave with this group.
Well, if you have the word first, then it's only the second last word.
What are you thinking, Greg? Be more specific. That's pretty big.
Well, I just wanted you to give you a free, instead of having to answer a question, I wanted you to share what's on your heart. I'll make up a question if you want me to.
Just a big, people matter. That is the point of what you're doing, is the glory of God through loving people. And so if you're trying to do your job and it doesn't include the centrality of raising up people, you're not doing your job. You've let the system control you and your schedule, and you're falling away from being centered on what you're about. What you're about is making disciples of all nations who make disciples of all nations. And all the other stuff's critical. We know all the job, so many facets of the job's overwhelming. But if you forget, the people are the point to raise them up. They're the means by which God changes the world. Not my particular something or another, and not some great idea I had. They are the point, and then God will be exalted. They'll be blessed. They'll grow. Others will grow. Others will be reached. God will be exalted. The process of the spiraling forward will happen.
Amen. Amen.
And I agree with all of that without any caveat, though I think there is something more to be said, and that is that what Chris just articulated is exactly what needs to be stressed, where you have preachers who have got swallowed up in bureaucracy and committees and study, and you forget there are people out there. But occasionally you'll find preachers who are swallowed up in relationships. A hail fellow, well met. They can talk to anybody. They're gregarious, they're friendly, and so on, and they forget to study. And as a result, they're robbing their people Sunday by Sunday, sermon by sermon, Bible study by Bible study, because they're not studying. They're not digging. Watch your life and doctrine. Let all see your progress. It's not less than both. So which things you emphasize in encouraging people in the ministry must depend at least in part on your diagnosis of where the weakness is. So some people have good people skills and pretty good teaching skills and all of that, but they're not praying much. Then they need to be encouraged to pray more. Others are more mystical and people skills and so on, but they're not studying. They need to be taught how to not only study, but teach others how to study. And others love books, but deep down they really think the church would be a nice place if there were no people here. and then they jolly well better listen to Dr. Morgan. It's really important to see that, spiritually speaking, a pastor above all is a GP, a general practitioner. He's not a specialist. He's not an ears, eyes, nose, and throat guy, or a gynecologist or whatever. He's a GP, and that's why a pastor needs to ask God for the gifts and graces and disciplines and so on that make him effective across the board.
Wow. Perfect. Thank you both so much. Can I pray for us? And then we'll close. Father, thank you for your grace, giving us these men to be teachers to your church and leaders and disciple makers. And Father, I just thank you that you have blessed them with your grace. I thank you, Father God, that you've given them to us. And I pray, Father, for Dr. Carson and for Dr. Morgan. I pray, Lord, that you would just continue to bless them with peace and clarity, that you would continue to bless them with focus, that you would continue to bless them with perseverance in the faith, keeping their eyes fixed on Jesus, who is the author and finisher of our faith. And I pray that you would encourage as they need encouragement, that you would correct as they need correction, that you would reprove as they need that. But Father, in all things, supply for them as they supply for us so many great blessings and resources to strengthen us in faith. In Jesus' name, amen. Thank you.